And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Mala, editor-in-chief at recovery.com, founder of the Synergy Center. She has experience as a leader, psychologist, coach, and professor. I'm going to start that again too. Today I'd like to welcome Dr. Mala, editor-in-chief at recovery.com, founder of Synergy Center, has a lot of experience as director, leader, psychologist, coach, and professor with a demonstrated history of program development and leadership working within the health, wellness, and fitness industries. She's worked within the areas of rehabilitation, pain management, traumatic brain injuries, military mental health, post-traumatic stress, holistic management, and more. Thank you so much, Dr. Mala, for coming today and for being willing to speak with us.
Thank you for having me, Athena. It's such a pleasure.
Oh, great. Well, I'll just start right in. First, can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey and how your early experiences have influenced your path toward becoming a therapist?
Yeah. My journey was quite extensive, and began, in the quiet corners of my childhood and was very rooted in my culture, which I loved. And I ended up leaning into so much, and still do to such it's a huge part of who I am today. But the downside was that in growing up in these cultural, kind of nuances and stigmas that just end up becoming part of the conversation, painful truths were seldom acknowledged. And there was silence, and silence was reinforced and certainly shrouded my early experiences of not only seeing abuse, but also experiencing sexual, physical, and emotional abuse myself. And it was a heavy cloak that I unwittingly carried into my adulthood. And by the time I was pursuing my master's in psychology, marriage and family psychology specifically, I found myself totally entwined in an abusive relationship. And it began with a promise of happiness, as they all do, a beautiful narrative that included me feeling like I was being a diligent Indian daughter, marrying within cultural lines, but outside of religious ones because we weren't the same religion. But as the relationship evolved, of course, as we see in abusive relationships, it turned into possessiveness and criticism and eventually physical and emotional abuse. And in a very cruel irony, I was blindsided by the abuse, despite my educational background, which was in psychology, like I mentioned. So there was a turning point that came that really was extremely harrowing. It left me with physical scars and a very clear vision that I needed to break free. So even though I had that decision in my heart and in my mind, the aftermath was not something I was prepared for at all. So you get to that point, you finally build into that courage of like, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to allow for this anymore. And you think, okay, I'm going to cut ties and I'm going to be free. But that's not what ended up happening. I ended up having a situation that involved stalking, persistent fear, of course, that went with that. My confidence was just whittled away. And it reinforced my own sense of self-doubt. And the other narrative that was constantly going on in my mind was, how had I, a trained psychological professional, become ensnared in this cycle? So shame and confusion really overshadowed my path. And then I sought therapy. It was like, well, I'm a therapist. I need to see therapists like this. We know this. What would I say to somebody I was treating, right? And I finally sought, help. And my healing journey was really, really amazing. It was enriched by a blend of psychodynamic therapy from a therapist. And then I had a very dear mentor of mine who was a very, very just like CBT, that was it, therapist as well. And so I had these two views that were really helping me with healing, and it was invaluable. And the beauty of it too was both of them, being who they were like, here's what our theories are, here's what we think, and now you go do, right? And that worked for me because I'm never a person who really just sits and does nothing. I have to be proactive in some way. And so that method worked really well for me. So I yearned for deeper healing. I had the therapy going, but I know I needed more. And, we know that our bodies certainly will reflect. First of all, there's the actual physical trauma that has gone through, you're healing through that, but then the aftermath of the stress, and the stress continuing and the fear continuing and the doubt and all of that plays a toll. And that really spoke to me. And like I mentioned earlier, my culture was such a huge part of my life. I was always dancing, I was always singing. Part of my dance training, I was Indian classically trained in a few different classical forms. But part of that dance training involved yoga. Even with my classical vocal training, that involved a lot of deep breath work and meditation for sure. And I just had this thought to myself, like, okay, if that did something for me before and how it always has been this anchoring point for me, then why am I not incorporating that with more gusto as part of this healing journey? It was there, it didn't stop, but I didn't intertwine the two. And then I started to, right? I started to put it all together. And that's when I was just like, oh my goodness, here it is. I'm feeling myself again. I'm getting back to understanding my identity, my sense of self, getting my confidence back. And, I really realized that embracing these practices was not just a therapeutic tool, but it was just essential. I just needed to have this as part of my daily life. And then that helped me with my professional growth. I was able to find that newfound connection with myself and, really shape that into my professional philosophy. And that really drove me towards an advocacy, a passion for advocacy and advocating for integrative approaches, specifically to therapy. And that's how I landed on program development. I knew that it wasn't just going to be about implementing it in session. It was going to be about, really trying to reach the masses. And I saw reaching the masses happening through administration. So,
Well, gosh, you said a lot that I
yeah,
wanted to touch on.
I
Um,
gotcha.
the first one piece of what you said that, for me is really important is that things that are not done or
Mm-hmm.
said, like silence, are
Mm-hmm.
things that actively perpetuate trauma, not just from one person to the next, but one community to the next and one generation to the next. So, I just wanted to highlight that piece that the silence is really a way to continue the abuse,
Yeah,
and permission for it in a certain way, like not intervening is permission.
right.
And those are the things that really get me.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you talked about that I think is just so important is incorporating the body in the recovery process. Obviously our bodies and minds are not separate and they live in the same house. So just addressing one piece of who we are is obviously going to be insufficient. And I could comment more and more on everything you said. But those are the things that stood out.
Yeah, yeah, no, it really, going back to the silence feature, I think there's something to be said about the stigma, right? I mean, we are in a culture, I'm in a culture where the silence has been just the norm. Like you being silent, that meant that you were strong and, stoic, and you were able to weather anything, and you weren't vulnerable, right? And you kind of had like this clean slate. I had the unfortunate experience, like I mentioned, also of seeing actual abuse happen to a very loved family member, beloved family member of mine. And um, that really made an impact because and I was very young when I saw that happen too. So not only did I have my first abusive incident when I was a child, but then going further in the timeline, I saw her go through this, and it was all just be quiet, silence, don't talk about it, fake like it didn't happen kind of a situation. And those weren't the words that were uttered, but it was certainly a
The
situation.
message was, mm-hmm,
Yeah. And
yeah.
I remember going to my mom saying at the age of 10, you know, what if I could talk to somebody, like, would that be something we could set up? And this was at a time when, like psychology as a profession, whether you were a psychologist or seeing a psychologist, there was some element of something's not right, and it was stigmatized for sure. So that question, of course, was not received very well, but the answer that I got back was, honey, I hear that you want to talk to somebody, talk to me. What would you like to talk about? Which I was so thankful for. My mom gave me that for sure. But what was happening to the person that I was seeing go through this was that isolation, which of course, as we know, it was, reinforced. The isolation was reinforced. And I just wanted to be there for her. Right.
Mm.
And that's what really started it. I was just wanting to sit there and hold her and talk to her. And I knew that the silence was not right. I knew that the isolation was not right at that age of 10. Right.
Mm.
And I had this dream of being an MD. Actually, I got into a medical program, was on track to do, full out medical work. And I was actually put down for sitting and talking to to my
Oh, whoops.
the
Talking to
comment,
your patients.
the commentary was, you got to get out of the room in no more, like 5 minutes or less. That's it. You
Oh.
can't sit there and talk. And this was also at a time when functional medicine wasn't really around, let alone integrative approaches. So I was like, this is not happening. I literally felt shut down, and I isolated too at that point in time. That was, in the accelerated program. I felt lost. I didn't know what to do, but then I happened upon a biopsychology class, and I was just in heaven. I was in heaven. I was like, are you serious? We can combine all of this together and I get to talk to people and listen to people? Like, that's amazing. So, I mean, it all did work out, but those roots, like seeing the silence, having that silence reinforced, seeing the isolative tendencies and how that really just exacerbates anything that a person is going through in the wrong direction was what motivated.
Mm, yes.
Yeah.
Well, another piece of, your professional journey that you reflected on also that I wanted to circle back to is that, nobody is immune. That
Mm-hmm.
even those of us who are in the field, it's really difficult to see yourself and to
Mm-hmm.
see your situation when you're so close to it. But it can be really compounding of shame and stigma when you're
Yeah.
in a profession where you're supposed to know. So it takes a lot of courage to ask
Yeah.
for help and to move forward.
Yeah. And I'm so thankful because it could have been met with, a lot of different reactions, but I was so thankful that it wasn't. I
Mm,
had a beautiful program where my mentors that I selected were just so incredibly supportive. That really was part of what helped pull me through that shame, the narrative of shame that I was putting myself through. And also firsthand realizing how that cycle of abuse really does suck you in and has this tendency to keep you locked in it, right?
yeah.
Um, that's just, it's crazy how
And
that,
that's the mystery, right? To so many outsiders, they don't, people say, why? Why are you staying? Well,
yeah,
it's a really
yeah,
good question. Yeah, it
yeah,
is very difficult to break free of that. And it sounds like there was a moment, sort of a turning point where you did realize you needed to break
yeah,
free. And obviously that was not the end of your journey, but
yeah.
you don't need to share the specific moment if you don't want to, but I'm curious about like, how did you find that clarity in the midst of the cloudiness, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the way I can describe it is that every incident and every conversation, mode of communication, everything that happened until that moment, right now, for me, when I reflect back on it, feels like it's a haze.
Oh,
And when I ended up in the situation that was very physically aggressive, glass was being shattered, there was a lot of bad stuff that was happening there that I remember I fell on the ground at one point and my head did hit the ground. And it kind of felt like I got slapped out of it in that.
oh,
It was, I mean, it's a horrible situation,
of
but
course. Yeah.
that the shattering that I heard and then that impact, like all of a sudden I just like woke up. It was really an odd feeling, and
Wow,
even,
that gives me goosebumps. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Um, and that's when I realized I can't, okay, survival is one thing, but staying in this way isn't survival. So I have to stop.
Hmm.
I have to stop allowing this was the narrative that then came into my mind.
Yeah. And then there's all the risk that goes with leaving and
Yeah. Yeah.
which you also touched upon too.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What about, I mean, Eastern Asian cultures often have a strong viewpoint that marriage is the center of family values, often
Yeah.
encouraging gender-specific roles, strong familial focus on children. Could you comment on that a little bit as it relates to your circumstances?
For sure. Yeah. Again, I kind of, and this is what made the narrative kind of, interesting in terms of how could well, it reinforced the shame, let's just say. I grew up in a family where my mom was the primary breadwinner. My dad definitely was there, but my mom was like in the solid tenured position.
Mhm.
Both of my parents were professors. My dad ended up with a double PhD, and my mom just was in the same role for over 40 years, and
Mhm.
she was teaching music and teaching English, and, like that was her thing. So they were both in arts. My mom was working. My mom was taking care of us. My dad was working. He was taking care of us. There were times in his profession also where his schedule enabled him to be home for me and for us. And so the roles, like the gender specific roles, were not necessarily reinforced in my era. Now I have a sister who's older than me, and she saw a little bit of a different picture.
Mhm.
I think there was a little bit more gender conformity as she was growing up, and gender roles as she was growing up. But they were still both, my mom was still getting educated, my dad was getting educated, but as they in their relationship evolved, they shared a lot more.
Mhm.
And I never had a viewpoint of you're a woman, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And my parents never reinforced that for me.
Oh.
Um, there was an emphasis of marriage, though. I will say that, yeah.
Mhm.
Marriage was definitely a needed milestone. The idea being that if you were in our family, if you were educated, if you got married, and if you had children, and if you had the house with the white picket fence, then that was success, right? That was security, that was success. You're stable, everything's good, right? So there was a bit of pressure with marriage, but it wasn't one that I shied away from or felt the need to um, kind of like just go into early, which a lot of people end up doing depending on their families. Like it feels, and it's certainly in my generation and before, I would say, in the community that I was growing up in, marriage was like you're graduating from college, undergrad, you should be getting married. You're hitting your 20s, you should definitely be getting married. And that was happening. So we're seeing all of these emerging adults getting married and then having marital problems later on, and they're wondering why. Well, you know.
Yeah,
So
maybe not the right
yeah,
developmental stage for that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, while my parents wanted us to get married and to settle down, and what that equated to in their mind, there was a little bit of pressure for me. There was like, yeah, we want to see you settled, but they weren't forcing me in any direction.
No,
Um,
okay.
yeah, I was, I think, torn a bit because I wanted to marry within the culture initially because I thought that meant, like I said, me being a good girl, and that would make my parents very happy, maintaining the culture through marriage. Um, and and I never thought that I could break out of that on my own, but I did. And I'll tell you how I got there. So the initial relationship that was the abusive one, which was an engagement, it wasn't a full out marriage. I was very thankful for that. That one was where I was like, okay, I think, I'm being a good girl and what have you. But then there was this reality of like, wait a second, no, this is somebody within the culture and this is happening and it's actually condoned, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't, it was a disconnect. My brain was hurting, like I felt like I was twitching, like, how could this happen? Almost feeling betrayed, even though knowing that this happens, right, within the culture, within many cultures, right? And it's not, specific to any one culture, but I felt betrayed. And that then, once I started my healing journey and what have you, I just took expectation completely off the table. And this is actually something I've said to my patients and people that I've worked with is take expectation out of the equation, right? Because that helps. But I got to that place in my healing journey where I said, I'm taking expectation completely out and I'm being open to anything and everything. And I'm also not looking for anything in particular at all. I'm not looking for marriage. I'm not looking for relationship. I am always going to be looking for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to keep myself on my journey and I'm going to share moments with people. And if it happens to be that I meet somebody who wants to share my journey with me and walk alongside me, then we'll consider this. Right.
Yeah.
And that is quite literally the minute I was able to release that was when I felt the best in my life. And I ended up meeting my husband.
Oh,
So,
isn't that the way it goes? Well,
yeah,
you had set
yeah,
yourself up to
yeah,
be the authentic you, and we're always drawn to authenticity, I think, anyways, and removing those expectations, I imagine, help cultivate that.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
How long have you been married, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, yeah, no, 16 years this
Oh,
year together.
congratulations.
Thank you. Yep. 18 years together. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
How would you say, I mean, you touched upon this a little bit earlier. I'm sort of moving back to your healing journey and probably your approach with some of your patients and those you serve as well as an integrative practitioner. How would you say practices like yoga, meditation, deep breathing, etc., have contributed to your personal healing as well as professional development and or, what you see in those you serve?
Yeah. I mean, they were anchoring points from when I was a child. And then, that helped with my healing journey. I started to integrate consistent and regular meditations, and yoga practices, as well as continued on my dance and also started martial arts, journey when I was doing my healing process. Um, and then I came out of my master's program and I landed on my first job, which was in traumatic brain injury. And I was in a program that provided services residentially and outpatient IOP. There was a full swath of options. And I was working with the kids. So I was in the pediatric department. And I just, ended up in these situations with a few clients. And I could definitely name the moment where it was happening, where it was like, we're not going to sit next to each other, like sit in front of each other and do the traditional thing. We're actually going to sit on the ground and we're going to just talk this out when you're ready to do it. And if you're not, we're just going to sit here and breathe. And I just started doing deep breathing practices and then saw that the child who I was working with started to do the same thing. And then by the end of the session, of course, what happened, we started getting, all of the conversation coming.
Yeah.
So that's when it was the aha moment, where it was like, wait a second, we can really make this be an interesting thing. We can integrate this in, we can see how it works. And I was able to start a yoga program and a meditation program at that facility. And then the other therapists who were there in other disciplines and modalities were like, what if we did this simultaneously to this therapy, and so we started integrating it into therapeutic sessions and other modalities and started to see amazing results. So that was the other aha moment where it was like, this needs to be a for real thing. This needs to be part of the programming. And unfortunately, I was met with resistance in terms of deeper program development there, but that's also what made me look for another role, which then facilitated that ability. So, it was not a bad thing. It actually it reinforced my passion for it. And, the results were amazing. We were able to not only have in the realm of traditional therapy, we were combining it with CBT, mindfulness, meditation, deep breathing, all of it. And we were seeing amazing results. And then integrating it into other modalities also, we saw so many gains for rehab within the TBI realm. So it was amazing. It was a great time. The other thing that a lot of people don't know about me is that simultaneous to me being in my master's program, I was working on an education degree as well. So it was teaching K through 12 and specifically the middle schoolers, so 6 through 8. And that was another really great place where I integrated these practices into the classroom. And I remember being told, I was specifically in the ESL department, and I remember the principal coming up to me and saying, "You're never going to get these kids to actually
You
appreciate."
say,
And
watch me.
yeah, I love it when people say that to me because I'm like,
Yeah.
challenge.
Really?
So like you're never gonna get these people to, like appreciate, let alone like I'll be excited if you can get them to, have a sentence, say a sentence. And by the end of the summer program, so I took a full academic year, but then focused my summer school program specifically on developing and producing a play that the kids wanted to put on. We got them to do Shakespeare and we did Much Ado About Nothing. So
I love it. Who
yeah,
would have thought?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, it was amazing. So these little, ESL sixth graders and seventh graders and eighth graders were running around quoting Shakespeare, and I just looked at my principal and I went, so I should have that.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, but it's just amazing the power that these integrative and holistic practices have. It's not just about within the therapeutic realm and even with other therapeutic modalities, but within the educational system, integrating these types of things in can really give the kids, the ability to connect with themselves at a time when they're so needing that, they're needing to be able to ground in and tie and connect to themselves. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful. And
Thank
what
you.
would you say then, you're talking about using these integrative approaches in the educational setting and obviously within the mental health and behavioral health sphere as well, but specifically for trauma survivors, how would you say that these approaches are relevant or important?
Yeah. So one thing also, just as an example, within that educational realm with the ESL students that I was working with, several of them, the majority of them, were encountering trauma, were, coming out of their country in question where there was war, where there was, abuse, of course, going on, and even abuse within the household. So part of their shutdown and inability to be able to even grasp concepts academically was being hindered because of that trauma and because of that abuse. So in integrating these practices in, we were able to, get them to a place again where they finally felt like they had a voice and they had a safe space to be able to talk through whatever needed to be talked through. And it was really exciting because at the time we were in a setting where counselors within the school system were not necessarily revered for the work that they could do to facilitate that type of growth.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was so lucky because I was working in a district, here's breaking barriers, where my dad was, and my dad was the counselor. So he was at the high school level, so he was in a different building, but it was really great that I kind of had that in because I could talk to him about how we could work with these populations, and specifically, with those who had just come over and had encountered this type of war-based trauma,
Mhm.
generational historical trauma, to be able to facilitate their academic process. And he helped, a great deal with changing that within the district that we were in. So I was very excited about that. And that gave me again the motivation to basically say, no, you can make changes, if you do it from that programmatic level and do it from the administrative level, and it can help a lot of people.
It's interesting that I am going to veer away for just a moment because you're talking about so many different components of providing care or being in any system, and it's really difficult, I think, for clinicians or for but anybody in any particular role to look outside of their role and view the system in its entirety and figure out where the right entry point is to where you can be most effective in facilitating change. And it seems like you have a knack for that, of finding where you can, make your way in there and do something good.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think so. One of my mottos has always been always keep more than one door open. That motto got solidified after everything, right?
I bet.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've always had a passion for education because of my parents. And then I love psychology, of course, and therapy and all of the behavioral and mental health world. And so those have been kind of my two doors, right? Like
Mm.
there's always been a foot in education somehow and a foot in this somehow. And um I think keeping that perspective is what really helped me think from that 30,000 foot view of like, wait a second, how can we implement this in multiple places? Because
Mhm.
again, that's what's going to help the masses. And that has been a huge mission of mine that I've just kept, is how can I impact positively many people, masses of people, right? And that's actually also what took me to the military. It was knowing that, um, there was the challenge of turnover, because people are always PCSing and, deploying and what have you. But the families are sometimes doing that with them, sometimes not doing that with them. And I was able to implement, the same thought process of no, let's integrate, let's really enhance the programming so that we can support our active duty members and actually get them back to the, return to duty. That's the thing, get them back to duty, but do so where they feel that they are empowered and truly armed to be able to heal themselves. And part of that included empowering the family, right? So yes, to answer your question, yes, I think what has facilitated being able to kind of figure out where to put things in is being able to take that 30,000 foot view, but also, that initial want of being able to have multiple doors open so that I can learn more and assess more and see where I can fit these things in. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and then, in terms of your two doors, you often have to walk through the educational door before you can walk through any others. So providing
Yeah.
information about what you're doing that's palatable to your audience, like working with the military, there's a culture there that you have to,
Yeah.
become a part of to be trusted to even begin to have the
Right.
conversation. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Um, How would you say your cultural background with your family experiences your approach to working with clients from diverse parts, from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I think is essential is cultural sensitivity and awareness. That
Mhm.
definitely came, I grew up in a very, uh, let's say, limited, it wasn't a very diverse area of Michigan, is where I'm originally from, a small little Victorian town called Northville, and I love it dearly.
Mm.
Um, but there wasn't much diversity when I was growing up. And that really opened up the need for respect for those cultural differences because that's not something that I was always afforded when I was growing up. So it reinforced my want to be culturally sensitive. And when I say culturally sensitive, I don't just mean to ethnicity. I mean any minority population, any population, really.
Mhm.
So yeah, respecting cultural differences, part of what goes into that, of course, is avoiding assumptions. Again, so many
Yes.
people would make assumptions, and no, let's just not do that. So being open to, learning from other people and being educated by other people, especially when you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know, teach me and learn, that way that can help with building that rapport. So it reinforced that for me. The integration of cultural practices, of course, like I've said throughout our time together thus far, has been pivotal. Where I think also that in and of itself is stigma breaking and also assumption breaking, right? So a lot
Mhm.
of people will walk in with assumptions about culture and then, think, yeah, whatever, yoga, I'm not into that woo-hoo stuff. And, how is it going to actually help me? Or so what? I'm breathing. Well, guess what? They sit down in a yoga class, the skeptics, and then they're like, wait a second,
Mhm.
I feel lighter, that's great. Guess what? That's a cultural practice practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So being able to incorporate cultural practices, I think, has also helped with bridging those cultural gaps. And like I mentioned, just breaking down assumptions and stigmas. And in turn has also reinforced the ability to build in empathy and relatability in different ways, in different levels.
Yeah.
And thankfully now we're living in a time where talking about holistic practices is commonplace, and I think there is an art to integration that needs to continue to be refined, for these practices,
Mhm.
um, to match and mirror, like what is going on in our times and what the needs are of the individual person and or groups of people. But ultimately, the integration of those practices helps with building on that empathy and relatability, which we need so much of right now.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes I like to think about, or just sort of ponder what would the world look like if everybody had um, the same voice.
Yeah,
If it hadn't been dominated by one particular group, that how would innovation look different? What kinds of art would be out there, that isn't there, that exists but was silenced, etc. There are so many missed opportunities when we don't elevate voices different from our own. There's so much we have to learn. Um, so I was just thinking about that while you were talking. And the other piece about assumptions, they're tricky because you don't know you have them until you're confronted with the fact that you have them.
oh
That's
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was as a child, it was really just kind of shocking to me. I would literally raise an eyebrow going, what? Like this doesn't make
Don't
any
you
sense.
see?
Like, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we had pictures of, Indian sculptures and deities and, what have you. And my dad was an artist, and that was his first degree was in fine arts. And we had so much just Indian art around the house. And certainly, the deities of the different things, the different representations of gods and goddesses and the mythologies. People would walk into my house, children, my peers would walk into the house and be scared of what they were seeing because they weren't educated to it or aware of
Mhm.
it because it just wasn't part of the conversation. So to no fault of their own, but my goodness, was that an uphill battle, because there were so many connotations that came with that. Uh,
Mhm.
and even comments like, "Oh, are you the red dot Indian or are you the
Oh,
Afro Indian, the feather Indian?" Like those
yeah.
kinds of comments that as a child you're sitting there going, "What?" Like,
I can imagine, kind of. Yeah.
I mean, my goodness. So
Mhm.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that obviously contributes to the fatigue that a lot of minority populations talk about is having to educate
yeah.
just on a day-to-day basis or stuff your response, all things that require energy that it would be nice to free people up from.
For sure, for sure.
Oh,
And again, I'm so excited that we're living in a time of empowerment and advocacy, where my own children also have the ability to say, I'm this, And I feel very confident and good with being able to shout that out from the hilltops and,
Mhm.
that be understood. So that's exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot of hope in this time where we're, hopefully unsilenced
Yeah.
collectively. Yeah. What challenges would you say remain in the field of mental health
Yeah.
regarding inclusivity and diversity? And how do you address them in your practice?
Yeah. You know, I think we're always learning. We're always in a place of learning. And while there is, I'm optimistic again, there is the flip side where, there are individuals who I assume through time will always remain very rooted in older beliefs, and let's say less diverse beliefs. I think the lack of awareness or want to be educated by such individuals could be a challenge.
Mm.
Um, I think that if we continue to focus on the divide, then the divide will only continue. And so that's where, like I always step in and I say, okay, that's the bad stuff, but we can continue to sing the song of advocacy and empowerment. And
Mhm.
I believe that our voices will be heard. And I'm hopeful that with time, and hopefully with by the time our kids are, older, that their voices will be heard with greater ease. Just
Mhm.
as in my generation, this movement of advocacy and empowerment is totally different from when my parents were, growing up and, even in their prime. So I think the challenge is to stop the cycle, the cycles, right? There's always going to be abuse, there's always going to be trauma, there's always going to be some battle, some war, there's always going to be opinions. Um, but if we allow ourselves to think of ourselves as the cycle breakers
Mhm.
and we encourage others to be cycle breakers, we'll continue on this journey. We'll be okay.
Oh, I agree. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of hope in leaning into what is happening versus what isn't,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
great. How would you say, I mean, how do you maintain your own mental health and well-being as a therapist working with survivors of trauma?
Yeah. Um, so important to maintain my own practices. So, my promise to myself is always to meditate on a daily basis, which I do. And even when it gets difficult, in terms of timing, then I incorporate the kids into it as well because, there's so much to be said, not only about passing that down, but collective meditation is just such a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
So meditation is my stronghold. My husband and I also dance still together, so that's another kind of meditation that we share together. And those are the two big things. But I also love work. So
That helps a lot.
yeah, does help. And I do
Yeah.
see the work that I do as empowering. And I've always been on this track of being passionate about what I'm doing, but also being able to, like I said, the mission has always been, how can I help the masses, right? So um, that pull has definitely given me so much healing, and also makes my work not be work, right?
Mhm.
And I'm so thankful for the place that I'm at today and, like who I work with, who I get to work with today. That we're in an environment, so at recovery.com, where it is just healing is just the thing. Hope
Mhm.
is for everyone. Healing is the thing. We are doing it together. We are empowering each other. And it is magnificent to be in an environment where that is a reality.
It
Um,
sure is, isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, sometimes people say to me, like, how do you leave your work at home, or how do you handle all those stories? And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? It's just
yeah,
so so enriching to do this work. I feel so lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, from a therapeutic standpoint, the work that you do with groups of people, with one-on-one, the conversations that we have, my goodness, what a privilege. It is such a privilege to be able to be a person for, that person for somebody else who's on that journey. It is such a privilege to be able to say, you know what, I know what you're going through. Even I don't know what you're going through, but I want to learn so I
Hmm.
can help you, right? Um, both are just, to me, it's just such a moving thing,
Hmm.
uh, that keeps me going on a daily basis, and keeps me motivated.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what about your work though with recovery.com? How has this allowed you to extend the reach of your integrative therapeutic approaches?
Oh, yeah. So we, the editorial, the content team, that's my team. We are on a mission to educate, and we're doing so in a variety of different ways. So I'm spreading, word and education, and insight on recovery in totality. And that is such an amazing thing to be able to do. I mean, there are so many different ways we can do that, and we are continuing to build and grow into that. So it's a really exciting time for us at recovery.com, especially with the enhancement of the content that we're putting out there. So that's definitely one way. But in general, recovery.com, our mission is to connect people to treatment, to health, healing, those on a healing journey, no matter where they're at. And to know that we all are contributing to helping at least one person, find that connection to treatment, which we've done more than that, thankfully, amazingly and beautifully. The fact that we do that, and we're doing that for the masses, is just amazing. So the mission is just beautiful. And we're connecting people to that healing journey. We're helping loved ones help their loved ones find treatment, and then also themselves, work for themselves and treatment for themselves and education for themselves. And that is just an amazing thing. So very excited.
What I love that you're doing, I mean, there are a bunch of things that I love about what you're doing. But one of the things that you're talking about is innovation as a means of expanding access to care. I think a lot of clinicians talk a lot about, you know, finding ways to give people direct access to therapists, which we need, yes, of course, and there needs to be some other ways, other avenues to pursuing and receiving support. And it sounds like you're looking at it through a different bunch of different lenses and angles.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We are, and what's exciting again is that this is, our team is a group of people who are visionary, and again, to have that be encouraged at a workplace is absolutely phenomenal. So
It is. It's
yeah,
seen as a luxury often, but it's a necessity to get things going. You need to start somewhere.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
What would you say your future goals are for your practice and yourself professionally?
Yeah. So yeah, my practice is something that I get to oversee now, which is wonderful. Um,
Mhm.
and really, I mean, I think, with my own practice, I kind of get to this place where I'm like, I love the fact that it's kind of small and intimate, because that gives people, some semblance of safety and security as well. And it really keeps things kind of tangible in a way, in this virtual world that we're living in too. So um, I I foresee that just continuing and maintaining as it is. We have wellness services that we provide. We have coaching services that we provide, and therapeutic services that we provide globally.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's really exciting to see it, maintain and also grow. It really has grown, even though we haven't necessarily said, oh, that's what we want to do. We want to get to, like X amount or what have you. So I really cherish the fact that it's just been this beautiful little, seed that we've continued to water, and it's just grown on its own. Not only with our reach, but also through the services that it provides. Um, from a professional standpoint, I see myself continuing to be administrative and really put energy into that program development wherever I can, and however I can. And the fact that recovery.com has, such potential, and continued growth, we've seen that already. There's even more, that keeps me going. So I see myself continuing to, contribute to that, and, in many different directions too. So not just with recovery.com, I do a lot of volunteer work as well. So I see myself continuing to program develop wherever I can, again, to reach the masses. And I love being able to help people out. Again, that's why I do volunteer work as well. And one of the groups that I volunteer with is It's a Military Life, that specifically supports active duty and veteran and family members, dependents, and retirees. And so vets, like I said. So I love being able to put my talents to use with anybody who needs help. And it's been said, my my current coworker has actually said to me, "Oh, you're too nice. If you say yes to everyone." And I was like, "Well, I just
Could
want
be
to
a thing.
help everybody." Yeah, no. So no, there are limits, of course, but I don't see limits, in terms of how much I can help in a strategic way. So I always aspire to continue doing that no matter where I am and with whoever I'm working with.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank
Is
you.
there a message of hope or inspiration that you'd like to share with listeners who might be going through experiences that were similar to yours?
Yeah. I think, what I would say is that it might be hard to see yourself coming out of it, but recovery is possible.
Mm.
You're not alone. Everybody is on a journey. Everybody is on some kind of a recovery journey. And no matter who you are, you're on some kind of a recovery journey, in my opinion. And all you've got to do is start somewhere, even if it's asking the question, how do I get help? Or what does this mean? You've got to start somewhere. So start, don't hesitate if you hear that voice in your head, in your heart. And even if you don't, if you're hesitating, just don't hesitate. Just keep going and get the help. Talk to somebody, reach out, because you're not alone. And it will feel scary, but it's going to be okay in the long run. And really, recovery is a lifelong journey. So know that once you start it, right, you're going to be on it, and it can be a very beautiful thing if you allow it to be. So
Mm.
take that first step.
Well, what I love that you said was just start. It's a
Yeah.
perfect hashtag.
Yeah. Yeah. Good idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, two questions. The
Yeah.
first of which, is there anything that has been unspoken for that you'd like to speak for?
Mm, that's a great question. Um, I would like to say that, the stigmas that are alive and living amongst us, all of the individuals who, again, feel like they cannot speak out. I'm hopeful that me speaking out, and those who follow, those who already have, will inspire, and inspire you to know not only that you're not alone, but also that your voice matters and
Mhm.
that your story matters. So my hope is that I'm speaking for those who don't feel like they can speak right now, and maybe inspiring them to do so, and to know that they can get help. The cultural stigmas that are alive and living amongst us, um, while they're alive and living amongst us, you don't need to listen to them.
That's right. That is right. Yes. Yeah, thank you
You
so
know?
much for that. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the only way we can change is with our voices as a beginning. So, Yeah, thank you for speaking up.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for hearing me.
Of
Yeah.
course. And my final question is, how can people find you?
Yeah. So recovery.com is a beautiful space. You can definitely find the work that I'm doing there. On socials, my hashtag is, or my at sign is at the official Dr. Mala. So whether it's LinkedIn, TikTok, Facebook, Insta, that's the handle. And my personal website is drmala.net.
Wonderful. And we'll include links to all of those online locations at the end of the podcast. So I thank you so much, Dr. Mala, for your time. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your courage in, your process and becoming a leader in the field and giving voice to those whose voices are otherwise a little bit quiet at the moment.